2 years later, and it still feels like yesterday. If you're watching from America, from Norway, from Brazil or Japan, or anywhere outside the Commonwealth, and you still miss her, this video is for you. September 8th, 2022. You remember where you were, don't you? Of course you do. Because that's what happens when the world shifts beneath your feet. Your brain takes a snapshot and files it away forever. The Kennedy assassination, the fall of the Berlin Wall, September 11th. And now this, the moment you learned that Queen Elizabeth II had died. Maybe you were driving when your phone buzzed with the alert. Maybe you were at work, scrolling through headlines that suddenly didn't matter anymore. Maybe you were on a cruise ship off the coast of Norway, far from home and surrounded by strangers, and you felt something crack inside your chest anyway. Maybe you pulled up social media and typed the words, "Your Queen," using the possessive for someone else while claiming the grief as your own. And maybe, probably, at some point in the hours or days that followed, you caught yourself wondering, why does this hurt so much? She wasn't my queen. Here's the thing. You're not wrong about that. Constitutionally, formally, legally, Elizabeth II was the monarch of the United Kingdom and 15 other Commonwealth realms. Not your country. Not your head of state. Not your anything, really, except a face on magazine covers and a voice in Christmas broadcasts that weren't even meant for you. And yet, you cried anyway. Or you didn't cry, but you felt something heavy settle in your chest and stay there for days. You watched the funeral coverage when you should have been working. You couldn't quite explain it to friends who raised their eyebrows and asked why you cared so much about a foreign royal. I want to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. Your grief is not strange. Your grief is not misplaced. Your grief is not an embarrassing overreaction to someone else's loss. What you felt, what you still feel, 2 years later, is legitimate. It's earned. And by the end of this video, I hope you'll understand why. Let's start with the only place we can start. The sheer, staggering, almost incomprehensible fact of 70 years. When Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II on February 6, 1952, Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union. Harry Truman was in the White House. Television was a novelty that most families didn't own. The Korean War was still being fought. DNA's structure hadn't been discovered yet. The polio vaccine didn't exist. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. By the time she died in 2022, the Soviet Union had been gone for over 30 years. 15 American presidents had come and gone: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and she outlasted most of them. She was queen when the Beatles emerged from Liverpool and when Spotify replaced record stores. She was queen when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in July 1969 and when new space programs began planning to return. She saw the Berlin Wall built. She saw it fall. She saw computers go from room-sized machines to devices in everyone's pocket. 70 years, 7 months, and 2 days on the throne. Longer than any British monarch in history. For billions of people born during her reign, anyone under 70 as of 2022, she had simply always been there. She predated memory. She was part of the furniture of existence, as constant as the sun rising in the east. Presidents came and went. Prime ministers rose and fell. Wars started and ended. The world transformed beyond recognition multiple times over. And through all of it, there she was, same face, same voice, same steady presence. That kind of constancy does something to people, even people who aren't paying close attention. Here's something Americans in particular seem to feel, even if they couldn't quite articulate it: envy. The United States, by constitutional design, changes leadership every 4 or 8 years. The exhausting churn of elections, the constant anxiety about who comes next, the way every administration feels like a disruption of whatever came before. And here was this woman who transcended all of that, who remained the same while everything around her shifted, who represented something Americans don't have: stability, permanence, the long view. She visited the United States 6 times during her reign. She visited more than 100 countries total, more international travel than any monarch in history. But those American visits weren't just diplomatic photo opportunities. They were moments of genuine connection that Americans remembered for decades. Take Dwight Eisenhower. He visited her at Balmoral Castle in Scotland in 1959. The American president making the journey to her private retreat, where she felt most herself. They bonded over a shared love of simple pleasures: grilled steaks, good conversation, the countryside. After he returned home, Eisenhower asked for her recipe for drop scones. Drop scones. The Queen of England, exchanging recipes with the President of the United States, like neighbors chatting over a fence. She sent him the recipe in 1960, handwritten, with a note apologizing that the measurements were in British units. He treasured it. That letter still exists in the Eisenhower archives. Or consider the state dinner in 1976, during the bicentennial celebrations. Gerald Ford led Elizabeth onto the dance floor at the White House, and the band struck up "The Lady is a Tramp." The song choice was an accident. The band leader panicked and played the first thing that came to mind. Ford was mortified. Elizabeth? She laughed and kept dancing. She understood that awkwardness is part of life, even presidential life, and she wasn't going to make anyone feel worse about an honest mistake. Then there was Ronald Reagan. The two of them went horseback riding together at Windsor Castle in 1982. The American cowboy president and the British monarch who'd been an expert horsewoman since childhood. They rode side by side through Windsor Great Park, two people from vastly different worlds who shared a genuine love of horses. Reagan later called it one of the highlights of his presidency. Not a summit meeting, not a treaty signing, riding horses with the Queen. These weren't just diplomatic encounters, they were human moments, and Americans noticed. They remembered. The Queen wasn't some distant abstraction to them. She was the woman who sent Ike her scone recipe, who laughed off an embarrassing song choice, who went riding with Reagan. She felt real in a way that foreign leaders rarely do. Every time she appeared somewhere, local news cameras captured her meeting ordinary people, shaking hands, doing that little wave she'd perfected over decades. She became real to populations who might otherwise have known her only as a headline. Her coronation in 1953 was watched by approximately 27 million people in the UK alone, and many millions more worldwide. The first major international television broadcast in history. The rise of television coincided almost precisely with her ascent to the throne, making her the first monarch whose image could enter living rooms across the globe. Her face became one of the most reproduced images in human history, on currency, on stamps, in magazines and newspapers and books and documentaries, and eventually websites. Billions of people could recognize her more readily than they could recognize their own political leaders. And she maintained that recognition not through scandal or spectacle, but through steady, unglamorous service. This is the part that matters. Pay attention. When someone appears in your living room every Christmas for 70 years, when their face is more familiar than your neighbor's, when their voice becomes something you unconsciously rely upon without ever naming it, a relationship forms. Psychologists call this a parasocial relationship, a one-sided bond with someone you've never actually met. The term sounds clinical, almost dismissive. But here's what the research tells us. These relationships are remarkably real. The brain doesn't fully distinguish between the people we know face to face and the people we know through repeated media exposure. The same neural circuits activate. The same feelings of familiarity and trust develop. You didn't imagine the connection you felt. The connection was real. It just worked differently than the connections in your immediate life. And here's the crucial part. When someone you formed that kind of bond with dies, the grief is also real. It follows the same patterns as grief for people you knew personally. It hurts in the same places. It lingers the same way. So when you learned that Elizabeth had died at Balmoral Castle at 6:30 p.m. British Summer Time on September 8, 2022, when Buckingham Palace released that brutally simple statement, "The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon," and you felt something shift inside you. You weren't being dramatic. You weren't performing. You were experiencing genuine loss. The grandmother had died. Not your grandmother by blood, not your grandmother by law, but your grandmother by presence, by consistency, by the simple fact of having always been there. Think about what grandmothers represent. Not the immediate, intense bond of a mother, something one step removed from that. Steady, unchanging, a fixed point in the chaos of family life. Someone who was there before you were born and whom you simply assumed would always be there. Someone whose death, when it finally comes, feels like the ground giving way beneath generations. Elizabeth occupied that space in the collective consciousness of the world. And when a grandmother dies, the whole family grieves. Even the cousins who only saw her at holidays. Even the relatives by marriage who weren't technically related at all. Even the people who only knew her through stories and photographs. They still count. Their grief still counts. Yours counts too. And the world proved it. In the hours after her death was announced, something extraordinary happened across the globe. Not just in Britain. Everywhere. In Paris, the Eiffel Tower went dark. The City of Light extinguished its most famous landmark in tribute to a woman who wasn't French, who had no claim on French loyalty, but who had somehow become part of France's understanding of the world too. The tower stood silent and black against the night sky, a 1,083-foot monument to shared grief. In Rio de Janeiro, the Christ the Redeemer statue, that enormous figure of Jesus with arms outstretched over the city, was illuminated in red, white, and blue. The colors of the Union Jack projected onto the body of Christ, blessing a queen from across the Atlantic. Brazil, a former Portuguese colony with no connection to the British crown, paying tribute anyway. Because some losses transcend borders. In Washington, D.C., flags dropped to half-staff at the Capitol, the White House, and federal buildings across the country. The United States, founded in rebellion against her ancestors, lowering its colors in mourning. President Biden ordered the flags to remain lowered until sunset on the day of her funeral. The republic honoring the monarch it had rejected 2.5 centuries earlier. At the United Nations General Assembly, which was meeting in New York that week, the session opened with a moment of silence. Delegates from 193 countries, including nations that had fought wars of independence against Britain, nations that maintained no diplomatic relations with the UK, nations whose entire existence was defined by rejecting colonial rule, stood together in quiet tribute. That's what she meant to the world, not just to Britain, to all of it. Behind the scenes, the British government activated something called Operation London Bridge, the meticulously planned protocol for handling the monarch's death that had been refined over decades. But because Elizabeth died in Scotland rather than London, they also activated Operation Unicorn, the contingency specifically designed for a death north of the border. The unicorn, of course, is the national animal of Scotland. The plans dictated everything: how the coffin would travel, who would walk where, which hymns would be sung. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing could be. I know what some people said. I know about the eyebrow raising. She wasn't your queen. Why do Americans care so much? This is weird. She was 96. What did you expect? Don't you have your own problems? The dismissal came from multiple directions. From Republicans who saw monarchy as an archaic absurdity, from progressives who wanted to talk about colonialism instead of grief, from irony-poisoned corners of the internet that can't let anyone feel anything without mockery, from friends and family who genuinely didn't understand and assumed that meant there was nothing to understand. Maybe you felt self-conscious about your grief. Maybe you stopped talking about it publicly because you got tired of explaining yourself. Maybe you cried in private and then pretended you hadn't. Here's what I want you to know. Those people weren't wrong to question. Questions are fair. But they were wrong to dismiss. The human heart doesn't respect constitutional boundaries. It never has. We form attachments based on presence, not proximity, based on familiarity, not formal claim. A woman in Oklahoma who watched the Queen's Christmas broadcast every year for 5 decades had a more genuine relationship with Elizabeth than plenty of British subjects who never gave her a second thought. Love doesn't need a passport. Neither does grief. Now, I need to tell you about Princess Anne. If there's a single image that captures the weight of what happened in September 2022, it's not the grandeur of the state funeral or the pageantry of the line in state. It's something much smaller, much more devastating. Anne, the Queen's only daughter, was at Balmoral when her mother died. And from that moment forward, through every public appearance, every procession, every ritual of the 11 days that followed, she never left her mother's side. Never. On Sunday, September 11th, the Queen's coffin was transported by hearse from Balmoral to Edinburgh, 6 hours through the Scottish countryside, through small towns where people lined the streets, through cities where crowds stood in absolute silence, past fields where farmers had brought their tractors to the roadside in tribute. And for all 6 of those hours, Anne rode in the vehicle immediately behind the hearse, her face visible through the window. Composed, steady, watching. Those who caught glimpses of her face described seeing a woman holding herself together through sheer will. In Edinburgh, she walked behind the coffin in the procession up the Royal Mile to St. Giles Cathedral. She wore naval uniform. She holds the rank of Admiral as Chief Commandant of Women in the Royal Navy. At the cathedral, she stood vigil beside the coffin alongside her 3 brothers in a ceremony called the Vigil of the Princes, a tradition established at the funeral of King George V in 1936. When Anne took her place at that vigil, she became the first woman ever to participate. It didn't feel like she was breaking with tradition. It felt inevitable. Of course, she would stand vigil. She hadn't stopped since Balmoral. When the coffin was flown from Edinburgh to London on September 13th, Anne accompanied it. When it was transported from RAF Northolt to Buckingham Palace, she was in the cortege. When it was taken in procession to Westminster Hall for the lying in state on September 14th, she walked behind it through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of people, through the heat, through the crowds, through the unblinking cameras, through the knowledge that the entire world was watching, through all of it. The relationship between Elizabeth and Anne had always been one of the monarchy's more interesting dynamics. Anne, born in 1950, was known for her bluntness, her work ethic, her relative lack of interest in royal glamour. She was, in many ways, the child most like her mother, practical, unsentimental, devoted to duty over performance. When Anne was asked, in an interview years before her mother's death, what she admired most about the Queen, she gave an answer that in retrospect seems almost unbearably poignant. Her consistency, Anne said. She's always been the same person. A 72-year-old woman walking behind her mother's coffin. hour after hour, day after day, performing the universal ritual of a child who will not abandon their parent, not even in death. This is what got me. When I think about September 2022, this is what I keep coming back to. Because Anne's devotion made visible what millions were feeling invisibly. She carried the world's grief in her face. She showed us what it looks like to love someone so completely that you refuse to let them make the final journey alone. And here's the thing. You didn't need to be British to recognize that image. You didn't need to be a royalist. You didn't need any particular political stance on the monarchy as an institution. You just needed to have loved someone, to have lost someone, to understand what it means to walk behind a coffin and keep walking, because stopping is not an option. Anne gave us all permission to grieve by showing us how it's done. Meanwhile, in London, something extraordinary was happening. The queue. That's what people called it, always with the capital Q, as though it were a proper noun. And in a way, it was. The queue became a place, a temporary community that existed for 5 days along the banks of the Thames, complete with its own social rituals, its own microculture, its own strange and beautiful democracy of grief. The lying-in state ran from September 14th to the morning of September 19th. During that time, members of the public could file past the Queen's coffin in Westminster Hall to pay their respects. The line stretched for miles, nearly 5 miles at its longest, winding from Westminster across Lambeth Bridge, along the South Bank past the London Eye and the Tate Modern, across Tower Bridge into Southwark Park. People waited up to 24 hours to reach the coffin. The government created a live queue tracker online, a website that showed the current length of the line, the estimated wait time, and whether the queue was temporarily paused. People across the world, including many who couldn't be there in person, found themselves obsessively refreshing this page, watching the numbers fluctuate, participating vicariously in the pilgrimage. The tracker became oddly addictive, a way of staying connected to the ritual even from thousands of miles away. To manage the crowds, officials issued colored wristbands with numbers to everyone who joined the line. These wristbands became, in the days that followed, strange artifacts, proof of presence, physical souvenirs of an experience that couldn't quite be replicated any other way. People photographed their wristbands the way travelers photograph passport stamps. I was there. I waited. I paid my respects. They brought sleeping bags, folding chairs, provisions for an overnight vigil of their own. They came from every corner of Britain. But they also came from around the world. Visitors who had traveled specifically to be present, to bear witness, to say goodbye. And then there was the David Beckham moment. On September 16th, the former England football captain joined the queue like everyone else. No special access, no VIP entrance. He waited for over 12 hours, starting at 2 a.m. When reporters spotted him, standing among ordinary mourners in a suit and flat cap, the images went viral almost instantly. Here was one of the most famous athletes in British history, a man who could have pulled strings if anyone could, choosing to wait alongside pensioners and young families and people who had traveled from Australia just for this. When Beckham finally reached the coffin, he was visibly emotional. Cameras caught him wiping tears from his eyes. Later, he told reporters that he'd wanted to pay his respects the right way, meaning the way everyone else was doing it. I was brought up in a household of royalists, he said. It's a sad day, but it's a day to remember the incredible legacy she left. The Beckham moment captured something essential about the queue. It was a great equalizer. In that line, wealth and status meant nothing. Everyone waited the same hours. Everyone felt the same aching feet. Everyone eventually reached the same coffin and had the same brief moment to say goodbye. For a few days in September, the rigid hierarchies of British society dissolved into something that felt almost radical in its simplicity. Just people. standing together, united by loss. In that line, strangers became something like family. They shared food, conversation, memories. They talked about where they had been when they heard the news. They talked about what she had meant to them. Not the abstract queen of constitutional theory, but the specific woman. The face they had known since childhood. The steady presence that had outlasted everything else. Many who experienced the Q described it as one of the most profound social experiences of their lives. Thousands of people, united in grief, performing together the ancient human ritual of accompanying the dead. Grief is supposed to be private, individual, something you do alone or with your immediate circle. But the Q proved that grief can also be communal in a way that modern life rarely allows. All those strangers, standing together for hours in what could have been tedious misery, instead found themselves connected to something larger, to each other, to history, to the woman lying in state at the end of their long walk. September 19th, 2022. The state funeral. 4 billion people watched. That's not a typo. Half the planet tuned in to witness the farewell. In New York, screens were set up in public spaces, and British-themed pubs opened early, filling with Americans who wanted to watch together. In Sydney, people gathered before dawn, setting alarms for 3 a.m. to catch the service live. In Tokyo, in Berlin, in Sao Paulo, in cities across the world with no constitutional connection to the British Crown, people watched. Together, even when they were alone. Westminster Abbey held 2,000 mourners, heads of state, prime ministers, royalty from across Europe, dignitaries from every corner of the globe. On the coffin rested the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter. The crown jewels that symbolized the authority Elizabeth had carried for 7 decades. But the real congregation was the billions watching from home, participating in a collective act of witness that transcended any single nation or faith. The coffin was placed on a gun carriage drawn by 142 Royal Navy sailors, a tradition dating back to Queen Victoria's funeral. The procession wound through London's streets, past crowds standing 10 and 12 deep in places, past people who had camped overnight just to catch a glimpse of the hearse as it passed. And behind the coffin, walking the entire route to Wellington Arch, Anne. Still there, still following, still refusing to let her mother go alone. And then it was over. The coffin descended into the royal vault at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. The world exhaled. Life, as it always does, resumed. But here's something the immediate coverage didn't prepare us for. The grief didn't end. 2 years later, and people are still grieving. Still marking anniversaries, still finding themselves unexpectedly emotional when her face appears on screen. Still feeling that absence. When the first anniversary came in September 2023, tributes appeared across social media. People posted their memories, their photographs from the funeral coverage, their reflections on what had changed and what hadn't. When the second anniversary arrived in September 2024, they appeared again, not with the intensity of the immediate aftermath, but with something perhaps more remarkable, the quiet persistence of ongoing loss. This confused people. Shouldn't you be over it by now? It's been 2 years. She was 96. It was expected. Move on. But grief doesn't work that way. Not for people you knew personally, and not for the parasocial bonds we're talking about here. Research on prolonged grief shows that duration varies wildly depending on the relationship and the circumstances. The loss of a constant, stable presence, something that anchored your sense of how the world worked, can take years to fully integrate. The first anniversary is often harder than the immediate aftermath because the numbness has worn off. The second anniversary brings its own particular pain, the settling in of permanent absence. If you're still grieving Queen Elizabeth, you're not stuck. You're not pathological. You're following the same patterns that humans have followed for millennia when they lose someone who mattered. The grandmother is still gone. You're still allowed to miss her. I want to circle back to something I said at the beginning. This video is for the people who felt self-conscious about their grief, who heard she wasn't your queen and wondered if maybe they were being ridiculous. You weren't being ridiculous. You formed a real connection with a real person who happened to occupy an extraordinary position for an extraordinary length of time. She entered your awareness early, and she stayed there. She became, without either of you choosing it, part of how you understood the world. And when she left, something changed. That's not embarrassing. That's human. We are built to form attachments. We're social creatures wired for connection, and connection doesn't require proximity or legal claim or shared nationality. It requires presence, consistency, the accumulated weight of years. Elizabeth gave us that. All of us. Whether we wanted it or not, whether we noticed it or not, she was there for 70 years, through everything. And now, she's not. 2 years later, and it still feels like yesterday. That's okay. Take your time. The cousins who only saw her at holidays, they still get to grieve. They still count as family. The love they felt was real, even if the relationship was distant, even if they couldn't have explained exactly what it was. That's you, the distant cousin, the one who watched from far away, the one who cared more than they expected to, the one who still misses her. Your grief is valid. Your connection was real. And if you need permission to keep feeling what you feel, consider this permission granted. She was the world's grandmother, and when a grandmother dies, we mourn. All of us. Together. Rest well, ma'am. We remember you. Subscribe for more stories like this.